Do you understand what you've done? The voice echoed in Ethan Cole's mind long before anyone actually asked it. The kind of question that didn't wait for answers, only consequences. But 6 hours earlier, he had just been a maintenance tech on orbital station K-12, adjusting a stubborn coolant valve that had more attitude than most people he worked with, telling himself for the third time that he really should have taken that job back in Ohio, where gravity behaved and coffee didn't taste like. Recycled regret. When the alert came in, unidentified vessel drifting just outside standard traffic lanes, no response, no registry, which usually meant one of two things: nothing or trouble. And in Ethan's experience, those were often the same thing, wearing different uniforms. So he grabbed his toolkit, because that was what he did when things didn't make sense. He fixed them, or at least made them slightly less broken. And he stepped into the docking corridor where the lights hummed softly like they disapproved of curiosity. The airlock opened with a sigh that felt almost reluctant, and inside the small craft everything was too quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that felt like it was holding its breath, waiting to see what you'd do next. And that was when he saw her, lying against the curved interior wall, as if the ship itself had tried to keep her upright and failed politely. She looked human at first glance, which was his first mistake, because nothing about her quite matched. Not the faint silver tone of her skin, not the way her long, elegant ears angled slightly back as if listening to something beyond the room, not the subtle glow beneath her collarbone that pulsed faintly like a heartbeat trying to remember its rhythm. Ethan froze for exactly 1 second, which he considered a personal best given the circumstances, then exhaled and stepped closer. Okay, he muttered under his breath. Either I'm hallucinating or this is above my pay grade. And statistically, I don't hallucinate before lunch. There were no other life signs, no obvious controls, just her, breathing shallow, uneven, like every inhale had to negotiate its terms. His wrist scanner chirped once, confused in a way only machines could be, and displayed a message he had never seen before. Unknown biology. Do not interact. Ethan stared at it, then at her, then back at the scanner. That feels less like advice and more like a suggestion, he said quietly, kneeling beside her, because the thing about rules was that they worked best when someone else was in charge, and right now there was just him, a quiet ship, and a woman who was very clearly running out of time. He hesitated for half a heartbeat, not because he didn't know what to do, but because he understood exactly what it might cost. And then he reached out and touched her wrist, and the universe reacted. The ship lit up, not violently, not dramatically, but with a precise, deliberate glow, like a system waking up after waiting a very long time for the correct input. Ethan blinked. That seems promising, he said, because optimism was easier than panic. The glow spread from his hand to hers, then up along her arm in faint lines of light that mapped something he couldn't begin to understand. His scanner went silent, then rebooted, which Ethan took as a sign that things were officially above its pay grade as well. Her breathing steadied, not fully, not safely, but enough to suggest that whatever he had just done had mattered. And then the ship spoke, not through speakers, not exactly, but through the air itself, a voice that sounded less like sound and more like meaning being gently placed inside his head. Biological compatibility confirmed. It said, calm, certain, initiating life preservation protocol. Ethan sat back slightly, heart picking up speed as if it had finally realized the situation. Yeah, he murmured, that sounds about right. But then the voice continued, softer now, almost thoughtful. Binding sequence initiated. And something in that word, binding, settled into his chest with a weight he couldn't quite explain. The woman's fingers moved then, weak but intentional, closing around his hand with surprising strength for someone who had been moments from slipping away. Her eyes fluttered, not fully open, just enough to reveal a flash of something ancient and aware. And for the first time since stepping into the ship, Ethan had the distinct, uncomfortable feeling that this wasn't an accident, that he hadn't just found her, that something had been waiting, very patiently, for him to arrive. And as the light around them stabilized into a steady, quiet glow, the voice spoke again, final this time. Exchange acknowledged, it said, and Ethan frowned slightly. Because that was a word with implications. Define exchange, he muttered, already suspecting he wasn't going to like the answer, but the ship did not elaborate. Not yet. and somewhere deep in the station behind him, alarms began to stir, as if reality itself had just noticed something had changed. The alarms did not blare so much as hesitate, as if the station itself was unsure whether this qualified as an emergency or a misunderstanding, and Ethan found that oddly comforting. Because he was not entirely sure either, he was still kneeling beside her, her hand wrapped around his with quiet insistence, the glow beneath her skin now steady, organized, like something that had stopped failing and started deciding. And for a moment he allowed himself to believe that was enough, that he had done his job, stabilized a patient, improvised a solution, survived another shift that would never make it into any official report. But then his wrist scanner came back online with a soft chime that carried far more judgment than sound. New text replacing the old warning with clinical precision. Link established. External system priority override. Ethan frowned. That sounds like paperwork I do not remember filing. He muttered, because humor was still the only tool he trusted, even now, especially now. The ship responded before the station could, the same voice settling into the air again, closer this time, more aware. You initiated preservation, it said, as if reminding him of a choice he did not recall making quite so formally. Ethan nodded slowly. Yes, that was the general idea, he replied, glancing toward the airlock where distant footsteps and voices were beginning to gather. The station had noticed. Eventually it always did. But the voice continued, calm and precise. Preservation requires equivalence. And that word again, equivalence, landed heavier than it should have, like a contract written in a language he almost understood. Ethan exhaled. Define equivalence, he said, more carefully now. And the ship obliged this time, not with a long explanation, but with a single line. That felt final in a way he could not negotiate. Life sustained in exchange for origin relinquished. Ethan stared at the text that appeared on his scanner, the words rearranging themselves into something much less abstract, something painfully clear. Origin relinquished, he repeated under his breath. You mean Earth? There was no hesitation in the response. Confirmed. The woman's grip tightened slightly, not strong, not demanding, but present, and her eyes opened a fraction more, enough for him to see that same impossible awareness looking back at him, not confused, not afraid, just certain, as if she had known this outcome long before he had stepped into her ship, and that realization settled somewhere deep in his chest, uncomfortable and steady, like gravity shifting just enough to remind him it was still in charge. The voices outside the airlock grew louder now, security protocols, containment procedures, words like quarantine and unknown asset drifting through the corridor, all of them very reasonable, all of them very late. Ethan glanced back toward the exit, calculating distances, options, the familiar instinct to step away before things became complicated, before decisions became permanent. He had always been good at that, fixing what he could, leaving before the consequences arrived. But her hand did not let go, and for the first time, he realized that this was not a situation he could exit politely. Not anymore. The ship dimmed slightly, focusing its light around them as if narrowing the world to a single point of importance. Separation will terminate preservation. The voice added, not threatening, simply factual. Ethan let out a quiet breath. Of course it will, he said, because the universe had a consistent sense of humor, and it was rarely kind. He looked at her again, really looked this time, at the faint silver lines beneath her skin, at the way her breathing now matched the rhythm of the ship itself, at the way her gaze held his with something that felt less like a request and more like recognition. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a thought surfaced that he could not quite ignore, that this was never just about saving a life, that this was about being chosen, in a way he had spent his entire life avoiding. The airlock controls behind him chimed as security attempted override, the door resisting with quiet confidence, as if the ship had already decided who it belonged to. Ethan straightened slightly, his hand still in hers, his options narrowing with each passing second, and he found himself smiling faintly, not because the situation was good, but because it was clear. All right, he said softly, more to himself than to the ship. You win, and as if in response, the glow around them deepened, the connection between them stabilizing into something that no longer felt temporary, while beyond the sealed door, the station prepared to intervene in a situation it no longer controlled. Step away from the vessel and release the contact. A voice called from the other side of the sealed airlock, firm, controlled, and just a little too late to matter. And Ethan found himself glancing toward the door with the mild curiosity of someone watching weather move in from a distance, aware it was serious, but not convinced it was his problem anymore. Because the moment he tried to pull his hand free, even slightly, the glow beneath her skin flickered, not dramatically, not dangerously, but enough to make the point clear in a way no warning label ever could. And the ship reinforced it immediately. Separation threshold reached. It said, calm as ever. Reversion probability. Unacceptable. Ethan paused, then settled back into place with a quiet sigh. Right, staying put it is, he muttered. Because apparently his career had shifted from maintenance to existential bargaining without a formal transition period. The woman's eyes opened further now, fully this time, revealing a color he could not quite name, something between silver and deep blue, like light reflected off distant water, and they fixed on him with an intensity that was not invasive, not overwhelming, just certain, as if she was not discovering him, but confirming something she had already known. Her grip on his hand adjusted, not tighter, but more deliberate, fingers aligning with his as though matching a pattern, and for a brief, disorienting second, Ethan had the strange impression that the ship was not just reacting to them, but listening, learning, adapting around the connection they formed. Outside, the station's override attempts escalated, control panels flashing through security protocols, voices overlapping in that particular way humans used when they wanted urgency to sound like authority. Unidentified craft. You are in violation of orbital containment, someone announced, which Ethan suspected the ship interpreted the same way it interpreted gravity, as a suggestion rather than a rule. The door did not open, did not even try to. It simply remained closed with quiet confidence, as if it had already moved past the need to argue. Ethan tilted his head slightly, considering the situation with the same practical mindset he applied to malfunctioning systems. Input, output, consequences. He had saved her. That part was clear, the cost had been stated. Also clear, what remained unclear was everything else, including why the word binding still echoed in his mind like a line of code he had not meant to run. What exactly did we just agree to? He asked, not expecting a comforting answer. The ship responded without hesitation. Life exchange complete. It said, subject Lyra Vale stabilized. The name settled into the space between them, Lyra Vale, and something about hearing it made the situation feel less abstract, more real, more personal. Ethan nodded once. Good. Lyra it is, he said quietly, testing the name like a piece of unfamiliar equipment. Her expression shifted at the sound. Not a full reaction, not yet, but enough of a change to register, a faint softening at the edges of her gaze, a micro-adjustment in her posture that suggested awareness beyond simple recovery. And then the ship continued. Designation, primary air. Ethan blinked, because that was not the kind of detail you slipped into a conversation casually. I am sorry, what? He said, but the voice did not elaborate. It did not need to, because outside the airlock, the tone of the voices changed almost instantly. As if someone had just updated the situation from problem to crisis, commands became sharper, more careful. The kind of careful that came from realizing you were no longer in control of the variables. Inside, the light shifted again, softer now, less diagnostic, and more attentive, if that was the right word. Lyra's hand moved slightly, guiding his closer to the center of her chest where the glow was strongest, and when his palm aligned with that steady pulse, the connection between them deepened in a way that was impossible to measure, but impossible to ignore. Ethan inhaled slowly, the air feeling different somehow, charged, aware, like the room itself had taken a step closer. Okay, he said under his breath, not panicked, not calm, just honest. This is new. And for the first time since the alarms began, he stopped looking toward the door, because something told him that whatever came next was not waiting outside. It was happening right here. With her, with the ship, with a choice he had already made and could no longer undo. You are no longer authorized to remain in that vessel. The station commander's voice cut in again, sharper now, edged with something that sounded uncomfortably close to concern, and Ethan almost smiled at that. because it had taken them exactly 3 minutes to go from ignoring him to being very invested in his decisions, which felt like a personal record. But he did not respond, not because he was being difficult, but because the moment his attention shifted too far from Lyra, the connection between them reacted, a subtle dip in the steady rhythm beneath his palm that immediately corrected when he focused again, like a system gently reminding him where his priorities now lived. And that realization settled deeper than he expected, not as fear, not even as regret, but as a quiet understanding that whatever line he had crossed earlier was not behind him anymore. It was under his feet, and it was moving forward. Lyra's breathing had evened out further, each inhale now smooth, measured, no longer negotiating with failure, and her gaze remained fixed on him with that same unsettling certainty, as if she was not just aware of him, but aware of what he had given up. And for a brief second, Ethan wondered if she could feel it the way he could, that faint, intangible shift, like a door closing somewhere far behind him, too distant to hear, but impossible to reopen. The ship seemed to sense the thought, or perhaps it simply followed its own timeline, because the ambient light shifted again, no longer focused solely on stabilization, but expanding outward, panels along the curved interior coming alive in soft layers of translucent data that hovered just at the edge of perception, not overwhelming, not intrusive, just present, like a conversation waiting to be acknowledged. Transition sequence prepared, the voice stated, calm as ever, and Ethan glanced around. Transition to what? He asked, though he suspected the answer was not going to include a return ticket. Home trajectory recalibrated. The ship replied, and that single word, home, carried a weight he did not expect, because it clearly did not mean Ohio. It did not mean Earth. It meant somewhere else entirely. Somewhere this ship considered origin, and by extension, somewhere he was now apparently included in that definition. You have a very loose interpretation of that word, Ethan muttered, but his tone lacked its usual resistance, more observation than argument. Outside the sealed airlock, the station's efforts shifted. Again, less force, more caution, the kind of caution that suggested they had realized pushing too hard might break something they did not understand, and that alone told Ethan everything he needed to know about how far beyond normal this situation had moved. Lyra's fingers adjusted slightly against his hand, guiding it just enough that the glow beneath her skin aligned more precisely with his touch, and this time when the connection deepened, it did not feel like a system responding, it felt like recognition settling into place. Her lips parted slightly, not in weakness, but in the beginning of speech, though no sound came yet. Only a breath that carried more awareness than before, and her eyes held his with a quiet intensity that made the rest of the room feel irrelevant. You stayed, she said finally, her voice soft, controlled, and unmistakably real, not translated, not processed, just spoken. And Ethan blinked once, because that was new. Yeah, he replied, equally quiet. Apparently I did. A faint shift passed through her expression then. Not quite a smile, not quite relief, something more restrained, more deliberate, like a decision being confirmed rather than made. The ship responded immediately to her voice, as if that had been the final variable it was waiting for, the light around them stabilizing into a steady, cohesive field. Primary air conscious, it announced, and outside, the corridor fell silent in a way that no command could enforce, the kind of silence that came from realization rather than instruction. Ethan exhaled slowly, glancing once more toward the sealed door, then back to her. And for the first time since stepping into the ship, he stopped thinking about leaving entirely, because something in the way she looked at him made it very clear that whatever came next, it was not a mistake, it was not an accident. It was something far more intentional, and far more permanent than he had planned for. The silence outside did not break. It settled, deeper and heavier, like the entire station had collectively decided that speaking might make things worse, and Ethan found that strangely reassuring, because for once the chaos was not loud, it was precise, controlled, the kind of quiet that meant something important had just been understood. He shifted slightly where he knelt, not pulling away, just adjusting to the reality that his hand was no longer simply touching hers. It was part of a system now, a connection that had rules he had not been briefed on and consequences he was beginning to understand. Lyra's gaze followed the movement, steady and aware, and for the first time there was something new in it. Not just recognition, not just certainty, but assessment, as if she was measuring him against something he could not see. Her voice came again, a little stronger this time, still soft, but no longer fragile. "You should not have been able to do that," she said, not accusing, not surprised, simply stating a fact that carried weight. Ethan let out a quiet breath, glancing briefly at his hand still resting over that steady glow beneath her skin. "I have a long history of doing things I am not qualified for," he replied, because honesty felt safer than pretending he understood any of this. Her expression shifted again, that same restrained softening at the edges, like a reaction she was allowing in controlled increments. And then, her eyes flicked briefly toward the sealed airlock, where the station personnel now stood in careful silence, waiting, watching. "They are afraid," she said, and there was no judgment in it, just observation. Ethan followed her gaze, then shrugged slightly. "That makes two of us," he said, though his tone suggested he was managing it better than expected. The ship responded before she could, its voice threading through the air with the same calm authority it had carried from the beginning. "External entities recognize status shift," it stated, and Ethan tilted his head. "Status shift is a very polite way of saying everything just got complicated," he muttered. The ship did not disagree. It simply continued. "Primary air secure. Bound individual confirmed." And that phrase landed differently now, not as a warning, but as a classification, something official, something that existed beyond his personal interpretation. Ethan exhaled slowly, letting the words settle. "Bound individual." He repeated, quieter this time, as if testing how it felt. Lyra's hand moved slightly again, not tightening, not pulling, just maintaining that precise alignment between them. And this time when she spoke, her voice carried a subtle shift, something closer to authority beneath the softness. "You are not bound to the ship," she said, her eyes holding his with that same unwavering focus. "You are bound to me." Ethan blinked once, because that distinction mattered more than he wanted to admit. "That feels like a detail you lead with," he replied, though there was no real resistance behind the words, just acknowledgement. The glow beneath his hand pulsed once, steady and certain, as if confirming her statement, and for a moment the rest of the room seemed to fall away again, reduced to the connection between them and the implications neither of them fully needed explained. Outside, one of the station officers finally spoke, voice controlled but edged with something new, something closer to caution than command. "Unidentified vessel. You are ordered to remain docked." And this time the ship did respond, not with defiance, not with force, but with quiet certainty. "Negative," it said, a single word that carried more finality than any raised voice could have. The lights along the interior shifted again, not brighter, not dimmer, just different, as if the environment itself was preparing for something, and Ethan felt it. Before he understood it, a subtle change in the air, in the floor beneath him, in the way the ship seemed to gather itself. Transition commencing. The voice added, and Ethan let out a small, incredulous breath. "Of course it is," he said, because at this point the universe had committed to a direction and it was not asking for his input. Lyra's gaze did not waver, her hand still anchored to his as the connection between them held steady, unbroken, and as the first faint shift of motion moved through the ship, smooth and controlled, Ethan realized that whatever he had left behind was no longer part of the equation, not because he had forgotten it, but because something else had taken its place, something immediate, undeniable, and standing right in front of him, looking at him as if he had always been meant to be there. The movement of the ship did not feel like acceleration. It felt like a decision, smooth and absolute, as if space itself had agreed to step aside rather than be crossed. And Ethan barely noticed the exact moment the station was no longer around them, not because it happened too fast, but because his attention had narrowed entirely to the point where his hand met Lyra's, where that steady pulse beneath her skin now matched something in his own rhythm, quieter, deeper, like two systems that had stopped arguing and started aligning. The ambient light shifted once more, no longer diagnostic, no longer reactive, but settled into a calm, even glow that carried a strange sense of finality, as if the ship had completed its first priority and was now moving on to the next, whatever that might be. Ethan exhaled slowly, glancing toward the curved interior walls that now displayed faint streams of data, not in any language he recognized, but in patterns that suggested direction, trajectory, purpose. So that is it, he said under his breath, not quite asking, not quite stating. We just left. The ship answered immediately, as if the concept required no elaboration. Departure confirmed. And that was all. No countdown, no warning, just confirmation. Ethan nodded once, because at this point he respected the efficiency. Good to know, he replied, though the words felt lighter than the reality behind them. Lyra's gaze remained steady on him, but there was a subtle change now, something less focused on survival, and more on awareness, as if she was no longer just recovering, but fully present, fully assessing the situation they now shared. Her hand adjusted again, not guiding this time, simply resting against his with quiet certainty, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them not empty, but full, layered with everything that had already happened and everything that had not yet been explained. Finally she broke it, her voice calm, measured, carrying that same restrained authority. Beneath its softness, "You understood the cost," she said, and it was not a question. Ethan let out a small breath that might have been a laugh if it had not been so tired. "I understood enough," he replied, tilting his head slightly as he considered her. "Lose Earth. Gain, whatever this is." He gestured lightly around them, and the ship responded with a faint shift in the surrounding light, as if acknowledging the imprecision. Lyra's expression changed again, that same subtle softening at the edges, but this time there was something else beneath it, something closer to acceptance. "You gained more than you realize," she said, and the way she said it made it clear that this was not reassurance. It was fact. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. "That sounds like something I am going to have to find out the hard way," he said, because that had been the theme of his day so far. The ship interrupted before she could respond, its voice threading through the air with that same calm certainty. "Approach vector established," it said, and the walls shifted, not opening, but becoming transparent in a way that felt less like glass and more like the absence of barrier, revealing a view that made Ethan pause completely, not because it was overwhelming, but because it was precise in a way that demanded attention. Far ahead, suspended in the darkness, was a structure that did not look built so much as grown, vast and intricate, its surfaces layered with light that moved like slow currents beneath a still ocean, and around it, smaller vessels moved in deliberate patterns, not chaotic, not random, but coordinated in a way that suggested a system far more advanced than anything he had worked on back on the station. Ethan exhaled slowly. "That is not a docking bay," he said, because understatement felt appropriate. Lyra followed his gaze, her posture shifting almost imperceptibly, not with tension, but with recognition. "No," she said quietly. "It is home." And there was something in the way she said that word that made it feel less like a place and more like a position, a role, something tied to her in a way that extended beyond location. Ethan glanced back at her, then at the structure again, and for the first time since the ship had left orbit, he felt the full weight of what that earlier message had meant. Not just that he could not go back, but that he had been brought somewhere very specific, somewhere that already knew exactly who she was, and by extension, who he now was to her. The ship continued its smooth approach, unchallenged, unhurried, as if its arrival had already been expected, and as the distance closed, Ethan realized that whatever came next was not going to be another unexpected event, it was going to be a reception. The structure did not grow larger as they approached, it revealed itself, layer by layer, like something that had never needed to hide, but chose to be understood gradually, and Ethan found himself leaning forward slightly without realizing it. Not because he was trying to get closer, but because the scale of it refused to settle into a single perspective, towers that curved like frozen waves, pathways of light that moved with deliberate rhythm, and ships far larger than the one he stood in drifting into position with the kind of precision that made human traffic control look like a polite suggestion. "You were not exaggerating," he murmured, because sometimes stating the obvious was the only way to process it. Lyra remained beside him, her posture now fully steady, no trace of the earlier fragility left, only composure, controlled and unmistakable. Her gaze fixed ahead with a familiarity that made the entire scene shift in meaning. This was not impressive to her. It was expected, and that realization settled into Ethan's thoughts with quiet clarity. The ship adjusted its trajectory slightly, aligning with a corridor of light that opened before them without any visible mechanism, as if the structure itself recognized their presence and made room. "Arrival corridor granted," the ship stated. And there was something in that phrasing that suggested permission rather than access. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Good to know we are invited," he said, though the word felt less like a question and more like confirmation of something already decided. As they moved deeper into the structure, the light around them shifted again, not brighter, but more focused, the patterns along the walls becoming more intricate, more responsive, almost as if they were observing. And for a brief moment Ethan had the distinct impression that the place itself was aware of him, not in a hostile way, not even in a curious way, but in the same way a system recognizes a new input and begins processing it. Lyra's hand was still in his, the connection between them steady and unchanged, but now there was a subtle shift in how she held it, not just maintaining the link, but anchoring him, as if she understood that whatever came next would not be simple. "They will know," she said quietly, and Ethan glanced at her. "Know what?" he asked, though part of him already suspected the answer. Her eyes did not leave the view ahead. "What you did," she replied. And there was no drama in her voice, no embellishment, just fact. And that fact carried weight, because it meant this was not going to be a quiet arrival. The ship slowed, not abruptly, but with deliberate control, coming to a stop within a vast chamber that felt less like a hangar and more like a space designed for acknowledgement, the walls rising high. Above them, layered with structures that resembled observation platforms, and as the final motion settled, the light shifted once more, converging toward the center where they stood, and for a brief moment there was complete stillness, the kind that did not come from emptiness, but from attention. And then Ethan noticed them, figures along the upper levels, not moving, not speaking, simply present. Their silhouettes defined by the soft glow of the architecture, long ears, composed postures, all facing inward, all focused on a single point, him, or more precisely, the connection between him and Lyra. "Okay," Ethan said under his breath, because understatement was still his preferred method of survival. "This feels official." Lyra finally turned her gaze to him, and this time there was no restraint in the way she looked at him, no measured distance, only clear, direct acknowledgement. "It is," she said, and the way she said it made it very clear that this was not a situation he could navigate casually. The ship responded one last time, its voice carrying through the chamber with a clarity that reached every level, every observer. "Primary air returned," it announced, and then, after a pause that felt deliberate, almost ceremonial, it added, "Bound individual confirmed." And the silence that followed was not confusion, not hesitation, but recognition, deep and immediate, like a system updating in real time. And for the first time since he had touched her, Ethan understood exactly what kind of moment he had stepped into. Not an accident, not a mistake, but an arrival that had been waiting for him long before he knew it existed. No one spoke at first, not because they did not have something to say, but because whatever this moment was required silence to exist, and Ethan felt it settle across the chamber like a held breath that no one wanted to break too early. The figures above remained still, their attention precise, not scattered, not curious in the human sense, but focused in a way that suggested recognition rather than discovery. And that difference mattered more than he expected, because it meant this was not new to them. This was something they understood, something they had rules for. Lyra's hand remained steady in his, but now there was a subtle shift in her posture, a straightening that carried weight, not physical, but positional, as if the space itself adjusted around her, acknowledging something that had nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with authority. Ethan noticed it immediately, not because it was obvious, but because everything else responded to it. The light along the walls softened in her direction, the distant figures angled slightly inward, and even the air felt organized, like a system aligning itself around a central command. "You should stand," she said quietly, not as an order, but as a correction, and Ethan blinked once before realizing that he was still half kneeling beside her, which felt increasingly inappropriate given the scale of what was happening. "Right?" he murmured, pushing himself up with a small exhale, his hand never leaving hers, because at this point that did not feel optional. And the moment he stood fully, something in the chamber shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough that he felt it. Like stepping onto a surface that suddenly recognized your weight, Lyra rose with him. Smooth and controlled, no trace of weakness left, and when she did, the change was no longer subtle. It was absolute. Her presence settled into the space with quiet certainty, the kind that did not need to announce itself to be understood, and for the first time since he had met her, Ethan saw her not as someone he had saved, but as someone who did not need saving in the way he had assumed. Acknowledgement sequence initiated. The ship's voice said, softer now, almost deferential, and from the upper levels, one figure stepped forward, then another, then several more, not rushing, not hesitating, but moving with deliberate precision, their forms becoming clearer as they descended along pathways of light that formed beneath their steps. And as they approached, Ethan noticed the details, the same long, elegant ears, the same composed expressions, but also the subtle variations in posture, in how they held themselves. And all of it pointed in one direction, toward her, not him, never him. Until now, because when they reached the lower level, their attention shifted, not away from Lyra, but through her, toward the connection she held, toward him. And that was when the first one spoke, their voice calm, controlled, carrying a resonance that felt less like sound and more like agreement. You have returned, they said, addressing Lyra directly, and she inclined her head slightly, a movement so small it would have been missed anywhere else. But here it carried the weight of confirmation. I have, she replied, her tone steady, unmistakably aligned with the authority the room had already given her. The figure's gaze then moved to Ethan, not with hostility, not even with curiosity, but with a kind of measured evaluation that felt far more precise than either. And this is the one, they said, not asking, simply stating. And for a moment the entire chamber seemed to focus more tightly, like a lens adjusting, to bring a single point into perfect clarity. Ethan resisted the instinct to shift under the attention, not because he was comfortable, but because something about the way Lyra's hand remained steady in his told him that movement now would be interpreted as more than just discomfort. It would be read as uncertainty, and uncertainty did not seem like a useful language here. Lyra did not release his hand, did not step away, did not create distance. Instead she spoke, her voice carrying clearly. Through the chamber, he is bound, she said, and there was no hesitation, no qualification, just fact. The reaction was not loud, not visible, but it was immediate, a subtle shift across every figure present, a recalibration that passed through the room like a quiet current. And then, one by one, they inclined their heads, not deeply, not submissively, but in acknowledgement, directed not only at her, but at him. And Ethan felt that more than he saw it, the shift from being observed to being recognized, from being present to being accounted for, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a realization settled with quiet certainty. He had not just arrived somewhere new. He had been placed into something that already had a place for him, whether he had understood it or not. The acknowledgement did not end the moment. It deepened it, like a signal that had only just begun to propagate through a system far larger than the room they stood in. And Ethan felt that shift not as pressure, but as clarity, as if the uncertainty that had followed him from the station had finally been replaced by something structured, something that already knew where he fit, even if he did not. The figures before them remained composed, their attention steady, but now there was something else beneath it, not curiosity, not caution, but calculation, as if they were adjusting expectations in real time. And for the first time since stepping into this place, Ethan understood that he was not being judged for what he might do, but for what he had already done. Lyra's hand remained in his, unchanged, unhidden, and that alone seemed to carry more weight than anything he could have said. One of the figures stepped forward slightly, their movement precise, measured, and when they spoke, their voice carried a tone that felt less like authority and more like confirmation. The bond is stable, they said, not to him, not even directly to Lyra, but to the space itself, as if the statement needed to exist beyond individual acknowledgement. The response came not from a single voice, but from the subtle shift of the entire chamber, a collective alignment that felt almost physical, like the structure itself had accepted the update. Ethan exhaled slowly, because there was something profoundly unsettling about being processed by a place that did not need his input to understand him. Lyra turned her gaze to him again, and this time there was no distance left in it at all, only direct, unfiltered recognition. "You are part of this now," she said, and the words were simple, but the meaning behind them was not. Ethan let out a quiet breath that might have been a laugh in another life. "That seems to be the pattern," he replied, but there was no resistance in it anymore, no attempt to distance himself from the reality unfolding around him. Because the truth was, he could feel it, not just in the room, not just in the way the others looked at him, but in the connection that still pulsed steadily beneath his hand, something that had not weakened, not faltered, something that had only grown more defined with every passing moment. The figure who had spoken before inclined their head slightly, their attention now fully on Ethan. "You understand the implication," they said, and this time it was directed at him, not as a challenge, not as a warning, but as a necessary step. Ethan considered the question for exactly 1 second, then nodded once. "I am not going back," he said, because that was the simplest version of the truth, and sometimes simple was enough. The figure's expression did not change, but something in their posture shifted, a subtle adjustment. That felt like acceptance. "Correct," they said, and then, after a brief pause that carried the weight of something more formal, "Then you will remain." The words settled into the space with quiet finality, not dramatic, not forced, just established, and for a moment no one moved, no one spoke, the entire chamber holding that single conclusion as if it were a fixed point. Ethan glanced at Lyra, then back at the figures before him, and for the first time since everything had started, he felt something unexpected settle in his chest, not fear, not regret, but something closer to belonging, not because he had chosen this place, but because it had chosen him in a way that could not be undone. The ship behind them dimmed slightly, its role complete, its purpose fulfilled, and as the ambient light of the chamber adjusted to a new equilibrium, Ethan realized that whatever came next would not be about survival, or escape, or even explanation. It would be about understanding what it meant to exist in a system that had already decided he was necessary. And as Lyra's hand remained steady in his, and the figures before them held their silent acknowledgement, one thought settled clearly in his mind, quiet and certain. This was not where his story ended. It was where it finally began.